There's a phrase I heard from this thinker I really like, Jordan Hall. He says, it's really important to remember that human beings are obligate tribal, right? Like biologically, we are tribal creatures.
Right.
So if you're into like paleo diets or whatever, if you think like we should design our lives according to our biology, we should be suspicious of people or of, okay, another way of putting it is sometimes people say to me, I just don't like dancing. And I'm like, do you really not like dancing, or have you just not learned yet how to enjoy dancing? Because in fact, dancing feels good. In fact, it feels good to dance.
Or is it that you have built extra layers of insecurity and self-judgment and whatever that's preventing you from...
unlearn. You need to unlearn your way into feeling good about dancing. And so there's a kind of similar thing when it comes to living in community, I think, ultimately.
I'm Ranjor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them.
Daniel Thorson has been meditating for the last 12 years and has a passion for the intersection of contemplative practice, adult development, trauma healing, and systems design. In previous incarnations, Daniel has organized with Occupy Wall Street, worked at a company called Buddhist Geeks, helped start the Boulder Flood Relief, founded a mindfulness education company, launched a new American political party, and spent over 10,000 awful and wonderful hours in formal meditation practice. Daniel is also the host of the Emerge podcast, which explores the relationship between inner and outer transformation. In this conversation, we discuss Daniel's emergence from a 75-day meditation retreat to a world of COVID and chaos, his path from alienation and heartbreak to growth and meditation, his involvement with Occupy Wall Street and its innovative, though flawed, radically participatory system of governance, his work at Buddhist Geeks, at the meeting place of cutting-edge Buddhist and tech cultures, the growing trend of communal living, from intentional communities to urban monasteries, the dangers of achieving awakening without ethical context, his involvement with Maple, or the monastic academy for the preservation of life on Earth, and how he engages with the idea that it might be too late to stop a global climate catastrophe. So let's jump right in with Daniel Thorson. So I'm sitting here with Daniel Thorson. Daniel, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, it's great to be here.
So before we dive into the kind of regular podcast thing that I do, I'd love to hear how you're doing, where you are right now in terms of everything that's going on in the world, because some pretty distracting things are happening. I know you're in a monastery right now, but that even there, the news kind of trickles in.
Definitely.
And so, how are you with the world right now?
Yeah. So I do live in a monastery, and I do read the New York Times every day, and often listen to the New York Times daily podcasts and the Ezra Klein show, and have a pretty diverse news diet. Try to both read the front page of Fox News, Drudge Report, CNN, just have my feelers out in all the different ideological positions in American politics. And through the podcast that I hosted for a few years, have a pretty pessimistic view of the trajectory of at least American civilization. And so I'm kind of watching what's unfolding, almost like I'm watching a car crash I can't look away from. And I'm really happy that Biden won, that's for sure. That's a really good thing.
Yeah, we were going to have this conversation the day after the election.
That was going to happen.
We don't know anything yet. But it's funny. You're one of the people I can talk about this with who would probably understand this fully. But like at some point during the election, when it was during the election day and later, I was really suffering with just following all the news. I'm like you, I have 5 different news podcasts and I check all the different news sources. And I was really suffering with the idea that it really was a possibility that Trump could get reelected. And it was making me suffer. And then suddenly the Buddhist thought occurred to me, which is, this could be an opportunity. Suffering is always an opportunity to understand where you're clinging. And it was like during meditation, I really looked into it and realized I'm still clinging to this idea of a just world, that the world had to be just. Like if the world wasn't just, then nothing was worth doing or living. And I realized that's not true. There's no reason to believe the world has to be just or has ever been just. And so that really, after a while, I started suffering less, and I was able to follow the elections and even enjoy the spectacle of it, because it wasn't just before and it's not just now, and the world has never been a just place. It's as just as we make it.
Yes.
But we never made it fully just.
Yes.
Yeah. So this probably connects to other themes that we could cover. How do you feel? So where does it tie with practice?
Watching, like paying attention to current events and
and just being engaged with the world, but not ruled by it.
To a large degree, or one of the main inspirations I have for my practice and why I live where I live at the Monastic Academy is so that I can open to the suffering of the world and let my life be informed by that without being overwhelmed or feeling numbed out, that it can actually lead to compassionate action. That's my hope anyway. Whether that happens, it's day to day. But for me, the image of monastery as a place where you go and ignore or escape the world isn't appealing to me. And that's very much not like the source code of where I live. The core teaching and framing of what we're doing here is learning to integrate awakening and responsibility, which means making them mutually supportive. So awakening is this more traditionally contemplative process of letting go, of deconstructing and finding liberation. Responsibility is much more about engaging in the world, fighting for justice and systems change, learning how to do project management and how to run a nonprofit and fundraise and do all the things that it takes to actually change the world. Both can change your perception as well as your behavior. And hopefully the idea is that perhaps that you can find a way so that these two capacities start to feed back on each other, such that the depth of your awakening makes you into a more responsible, powerful person and vice versa. Yeah, it's very much at the core. There's a reason why we had a current events lunch yesterday here where somebody found like a bunch of headlines. And so we were all sitting, eating in silence, and somebody was reading headlines, important headlines from the world, many of which were extremely
distressing.
Yeah, scientists think that the methane deposits under the ocean are starting to release, which could cause a kind of cyclical feedback loop in the climate in terms of warming. And just to feel that in the depth of your practice, how does that touch your heart? Because so often I read those articles and I'm just like, it's just like information going through my brain, and I don't actually let it hit my body. But that's part of the culture here at this monastery. So it's a little different than what I imagine some people's vision of what life is like at a place like this. And then we plug that into a Notion database. So if you wanted to investigate the current events a little deeper, you could just log into our shared Notion space and check out the article and all that kind of stuff.
Nice. You said the right keyword for this audience. So Notion.
I use Notion. Yeah.
I think
this monastery runs on Notion. It's just
nice. Nice. Yeah. That's very cutting edge. So cool. So I'd love to hear. So one thing I like to do with guests is try to figure out if there's any sort of consistent theme that starts early in life. And you might appreciate this from a Buddhist perspective. There is no self, right? And so if there's something worth talking about, it might be long-lasting patterns, just because they have been there the longest. And so my question to you is, what's something that you've believed or held on to since childhood that is still driving you today, that is still with you today?
Yeah. What comes up as from a very young age, and I remember this becoming more explicit in college, was a sense that I didn't belong, that I was almost like an alien in my family. In college, I learned the term alienation and started to study like Marxism and different sorts of isms that could shed some light on this way that I was feeling, that this place that I was in was not my home, that I didn't belong to the world or something like that. And to a large degree, that has been a big inspiration for my meditative practice, is to find ways to feel at home in my body, in my mind, in the world. And so it's certainly like a through line that I've identified as being highly motivating for my whole life.
And so when you say don't belong, and that definitely resonate with that feeling, but it could be interpreted in different ways. And so is it looking at people around and saying, I'm not the same as everyone else. Or is it like, I'm really not from this planet. I don't see the world in the same way, and like in almost like fundamentally metaphysical way, or something in between, or what? How do you?
Yeah, it's definitely, I know people who are like, I'm literally from a different planet, and who have that kind of belief about themselves and about reality, which, who knows? I don't know. But that wasn't the case for me. It was more, certainly in my family, I felt very much like, oh, I'm very interested in different things. I seem to just approach the world in a different way. I don't have some of the easy grace that they have in certain domains. And then when it came to college, it was similar. It just felt like things that came quite naturally to others didn't come naturally to me. And I don't know how much of this was true or just a way of looking that I had. And we could get into if that's even a useful distinction, but it felt like I was always on the periphery. I was always like on the outside looking in. And I recently sat a long solo meditation retreat, and one of the practices I do, I work with images. Images are one of, if not the way, that the unconscious sort of speaks to the consciousness. I've heard a teacher say that image is the language of the unconscious. And so in this practice, you kind of let images arise, and then you explore them a little bit. And one of the images that I got was of a me as a young boy, it wasn't actually me, but sitting outside of a house, looking in the window at the family. And there was a kind of like tragedy of being alone or having to forge my own path that was separate than what could have been easy and available, like that my family or friends might have found themselves naturally pulled into. I could have worked in the financial industry, or I could have, done anything, but instead I've taken a very strange path. And now I'm quite grateful for that, but it's certainly, it continues to be a source of struggle and tension in my soul and in my psyche. And I love that I've lived so far a very strange life, like not a very normal life.
In the best possible way, I think, but it makes you someone it's always a joy to talk to, and someone who's always, every conversation with you surprises me in a good way. And I think there's such a common theme with a lot of people that I talk to, of this feeling of not fully fitting in, and then later in life it can make you very powerful, because it's like a plant that didn't grow in a very specific vase, right? It grew in this strange way, and then you go in and say, no, we should adapt the vase to us. We should adapt the vessel to us, not the other way around.
Totally. Yeah. And that was very much the way it occurred to me on retreat. Was there was this like image that had been, I think, had constellated a lot of suffering and almost like trauma around it, feeling like an outcast. But as I spent more time with it, it reconsolidated as this really beautiful part of my soul, of my uniqueness, that here I am, like put in this position where I have to forge my own path in a world that doesn't make sense to do what my parents or my sister did. Like in my world, it doesn't make sense. I have to be honest to that. I have to live in integrity with that seeing, and that's part of the adventure that I get to live. And so there's something like, I felt like I really healed that, or begun to heal that image.
Yeah, we talked about this also in a sense of idealism, right? So how does this idealism, or how does this way of seeing the difference play in early life and any early decisions you made?
Yeah, I remember there was a quote that I picked for my high school yearbook that was something like, I think it was a quote by E.E. Cummings. I might be getting this wrong, but that the heart, and you correct me for the person who actually said this, but the hardest thing in life is to stay true to yourself, even as the world attempts to compel you to do otherwise. So there's this, I don't know where it came from, but there's a very like core to how my psyche got constructed, is this sense of, I will not give up my integrity. I will not submit to like a quiet life of desperation. And I did this exercise recently. I've done it a couple times now because it's so powerful for me. I think partly because I'm so motivated in this way, where you imagine yourself on your deathbed. I don't know if you've done this before, but you first imagine yourself on your deathbed, surrounded by your family and friends, not having lived according to what you know to be true, not having lived your true life, where you had compromised and made the easy decisions that the world perhaps wants you to make. And just, you feel how that feels in your body, and you really like marinate in what that would be like. And then you imagine again, imagine yourself on your deathbed, and you've really gone for the gold. You've made the hard choices.
You left everything on the field.
Yeah, you had the hard conversations. You worked in the way that you had to. And like, how does that feel? What is that like to be on that deathbed? And it's like, it's like extremely, I sometimes do that when I'm meditating, and I don't want to meditate or whatever.
That's really interesting and powerful. I think in a weird way I was blessed by a fairly obviously dysfunctional surrounding when I was growing up. I think it was a blessing because there was never any temptation to take the other path. But I've now spoken to a lot of people who had, it's almost like a less clear contrast where, hey, this is fine. It's not what I want, but it seems like it is working in its own terms.
Yeah.
And then it's much harder to make the cut.
Totally. Yeah. And for me, it was, I think partly I was so emphatic about it because I saw how easily I could fall into it. I have a tendency very much towards like comfort and just chilling. Like I can watch Netflix, like nobody else, I can just eat snacks. That's part of why I moved to a monastery, is that I no longer have a choice. I can't, because I don't have the discipline. I don't really have very good self-discipline. And so I just take it out of my hands by being in a system that compels me to do the things that I believe I ought to do for myself. And I think partly I was scared. And so that's why I like chose that quote and was very interested in alienation and these kinds of inquiries, was because I could see how easily I could just fall into patterns of compromise, really.
Yeah. Yeah, I have no more self-control than anyone else. I watch a ton of Netflix.
It's hard, man. The algorithms, they got us. They got you hook and crook.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about some of the milestones along the way. And when I talked to you before, you mentioned one of the most impactful things was this early breakup early in life. Mm-hmm. What was that like?
Yeah, so it was my first relationship. We dated like the last 3 years of high school and broke up either, I think like soon after we both started college, and being so like racked with suffering, both like pain, like the pain of loss, but also the dawning of the awareness of the pain that I had caused her, like the ways in which I had been unkind and selfish, and could start to see like the ways in which I was actually behaving in a relationship the same as my father. And it just ruined me. Like it was just more than my psyche at the time could handle. It was just like multiple structures were deconstructing and being severely problematized. And I didn't have any framework for anything having to do with internal or introspection or anything like that. This was before I had done any of that work. And it just hurtled me into this incredible social anxiety and depression and negativity and feeling lost. And yeah, it was at the time horrible, but now looking back on it, an incredible like a transition point in my life that I'm very grateful for.
Yeah, sometimes these breakups make all the difference. It's a similar story, but it's almost like the first step towards being a decent person is to realize that you're a jerk.
Totally.
Right?
Oh yeah.
Oh my God, I was a total jerk to someone I liked.
Yeah.
And some people never get there. Some people are just jerks to the people they love their whole lives, and then they die.
Oh. I feel so sad hearing that. It's probably true. I know it's true. I'm related to some of them. Yeah. Oh no. Oh geez. Yeah. And what comes up as you say that too is, in fact, that seems to be the case, like for the entire career of self-development, is realizing new ways in which you're accidentally a jerk and kind of updating yourself accordingly. Or discovery.
I may be getting to the end of this road because I recently read, I'm sure you know about nonviolent communication.
No.
And so I recently read the nonviolent communication book. And it's very clear to me that I'm not always following that in my life, and specifically the part about I can be a pretty judgmental guy sometimes, even with people I like. I'm be like, this is wrong, stop doing it. And I realized, like, at that moment, just reading it, I was like, yeah, I'm doing all of these things wrong and I need to change. And then I had this moment of, I changed enough. I'm 40. Yeah. I worked on myself all my life. And the level at which this is now is such a fine-tuned, tiny thing that the first thing to say is, good job until this point. You're actually stop feeling like you need to rebuild everything. So yes, read this book, take your time, think about it, change the thing. But it's almost like, at some point, I need to work on my self-acceptance skills.
Totally.
For a little bit before I can keep doing another massive renovation.
Yeah, definitely. And I certainly, one of my favorite parts of living in community is the feedback that I get from other people about how I'm showing up. And often I have gotten feedback. It's a great gift. And I have renovated my psychological house accordingly and dropped patterns that were causing other people to suffer unnecessarily, or causing me to suffer unnecessarily, or blocking intimacy. And there's a way in which that's like an infinitely refinable direction. And also some people, like, being a jerk is actually a portal to intimacy with some people. Whereas with others, they'll just turn off and back away slowly. And so I realized that to a certain degree, there are certain parts of my personality, like I can be a bit caustic and sarcastic. And I I have gotten feedback from people that they don't like it. And then a part of me is like, tough cookies. Like I like being this way, actually. Yeah. And we could talk about it. I'm happy to like repair, but I'm not going to let go of this part of me that makes me unique and I love it.
Totally. Exactly. There's I got to a point where I can say I can jab a person or say something a little bit like a little wise ass comment, and I got the art to the point where 95% of people are not offended by it or find that funny.
Nice.
And then there's probably 5% who are still annoyed by it. But am I going for 100% total affection and acceptance for everyone I meet, or do I want to decide where to draw that line?
Yeah.
95% is fine, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting what you say. I'm a bit younger than you, and I'm still wanting to continue to make serious renovations in my psyche. Kind of love that, actually. There's a quote that I heard not too long ago that's something like, "The good life is the life spent in pursuit of the good life." There's not like about getting to some place, but it is about this. I like refinement. I like this movement of sophistication, and I could be into a lot of different things. I could be into repairing cars. I could be into permaculture, but for whatever reason, I really enjoy getting into the nuances of how our psychology is kind of like interface and how mine is structured and stuff like that. Yeah.
And I think that's wonderful. And I think as long as you enjoy it, or you think that there's value in it, and keep doing it. And I do, and I keep doing it too, but also from a place of at some point I'm going to become an old man who is fine with who he is, because that's my goal in life.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Can I both totally accept myself as I am and like strive mightily to change?
Right.
I sometimes,
Right.
Some days. Yeah.
There's a lot of interesting undertakings in your life that before you came into the monastic academy, and you mentioned the Occupy Wall Street movement is something that you were really involved in. And so talk to me about your involvement with politics.
Oh, sure.
And how it started, where it went, where it's going.
Yeah. Both my parents are retired professors, and my mother was a professor of feminist political history theory, and my father was a pioneer in digital governance. So he did a lot of early work on what will technology and specifically information technology, how it will transform how we govern, how states govern. And so from a very young age, I think that was a big part of my world, was politics and the reality of that domain. And in college, I started this club, Americans for Informed Democracy, that was all about like exploring different issues and looking at stuff. As I mentioned, I got into communism. Like I dabbled in more radical sorts of political theories and got really into Slavoj Žižek and things like that. And I liked like radical theoretics a lot. I was really into debate. Like I was the vice president of the debate club. I actually went to the world championship debate competition in Ireland, which was really fun. Wow. And liked the art and the rhetoric of engaging about politics, because everybody really cared about politics. It was also a kind of like, at the time, a little bit of a status thing, I think. Like I can make really good points and like win rhetorically. And so like that was a part of my world growing up. And then after I graduated college and got more and more into meditation, I think that kind of cooled out a lot of the fire around that, but left this really seasoned kind of coal fire, like this really like permanent part of my soul that was drawn to systems change and imagining different potential worlds. And what if we could do Occupy, and like Occupy was just such an incredible, mind-opening kind of collective psychedelic experience without entheogens, but it was just like one person at the time called it a church of dissent, and it was really this kind of educational experience unlike any other. I was there for about 7 months and probably learned more in that time than I learned throughout my 4 years in college, practical skills that I then took forward into all my subsequent work at, Buddhist Geeks or here at the monastery, in terms of facilitating groups and how to hold skillful discussions where you integrate concerns and find consensus, and how to organize a protest in 2 days where you get everybody, all the different interest groups together and try to make sure that they all agree, even though they don't actually agree because they have different sub goals. And or we developed this whole system called a spokes council, which was integrating different decision-making bodies into one meta decision-making body. And we got a gymnasium in New York City, and we all went there and trained in how to do this really sophisticated, like almost parliamentary, consensus-based democratic system participatory structure that we just made up together. It was just so rich and interesting, and people just disagreed really strongly, and sometimes you could integrate it and sometimes you just could not, and it was horrible. And so I learned a lot about what does and does not work. For instance, like consensus-based decision-making does not work for groups of a certain size. It just doesn't. It starts to break down. Now, there are cool structures like Lumio, which my friend Richard Bartlett has created, which is a kind of like digital version of consensus-based decision-making, which dampens some of the concerns around scale with consensus. But in any case, I learned that, and it was an incredible experience, and encountering people like Charles Eisenstein and the idea of a basic income, and a lot of things that are now, I think, in the discourse, but at the time felt like just so far in the fringe of what was considered within the Overton window. Like it was like breaking that open in a big way.
I want to step back for a second, because for some people, everything you said might be something that they know already or that they're familiar with. For me, this is a brand new topic. So for me, Occupy Wall Street, this was my pre-interest in Buddhism, and I was actually living in New York at the time, and it was people camping out on Wall Street. That's all I knew. So you go there. How did you even get involved with it? What is that thing? What is it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a good question. Yeah. So the way I got involved in it was I had sat a 20-day silent retreat outside of Toronto in a Goenka retreat, which are these really intense 12 hours a day of meditation retreats. And so I came out of that feeling like really clear and connected and good. And one of the first things I saw on my phone was the Brooklyn Bridge arrests. And this was one of the major first events that really brought Occupy Wall Street onto the world stage. They got tons of attention. Basically, there was a march that was going across the Brooklyn Bridge that got stopped by police officers. People got pepped. There were some really evocative images that were released. And I saw this and then started to do research, looking at, just like I do because I'm a nerd, I grew up on the internet, just start peer down all the different corridors I could find. What is actually happening here? Having a kind of like distrust of the mainstream media narrative, and wanted to look a little deeper. And what I found was something that was totally inspiring and beautiful and idealistic and radical. And I had nothing to do at the time. So I was like, I'm gonna go down to New York. I have no idea what I'm gonna do there. And I just showed up. I didn't know anybody there. And to begin with, I just started by just meditating on the edge of the occupation. I just sat most days and just sat and waited to know what to do. And eventually I started to get integrated into it and found roles that I could serve the whole thing with, and I just went from there and kept participating.
So is there, from the outside, it looks like quite a bit of chaos and like maybe not a headless kind of movement. Was there more structure once you got inside, or what's
I mean, it's so fascinating. As somebody who's like really interested in emergence and like chaotic systems, where the movement between chaos and order, it was a very rich experience. There was this central governing body that was referred to as the General Assembly, which was basically just a consensus-based decision-making meeting that anybody who wanted to could come and participate in. Now, this worked very well when there were, say, like 20 or 50 people maybe at the beginning. But as thousands of people started to show up, it became ridiculous, actually. And you had this evolutionary pressure whereby we started to develop and then prototype different sorts of structures that could meet the increase in scale and complexity of the movement. And it was incredible. It was very exciting to be a part of that. And we were all kids. Most of us were like 25. It was everybody who didn't have anything to do at the time. So we were most of us were just kids trying to figure this out. There were some people who came who were trained in the anti-nuclear movement and had a lot of history with different sort of radical political organizing who came and, gave us trainings and things like that. But largely it was just a bunch of people who were passionate and wanted to serve, and I tried to figure it out, and we did good jobs.
It sounds like Burning Man a little bit. Like,
yeah, definitely. There was a lot of folks reflected that there was some symmetry in the idea of like radical participation and responsibility, and just a kind of vibe. Yeah, there was this sort of Burning Man-esque aesthetic or something like that. It's just like the tents. Everybody's in tents, and the food is being just given out for free, and it's very similar.
And just even the idea of this can-do collective spirit of let's just sit down and talk about it and figure things out, and let's make a construction, like an art construction, or it's not that different from let's make a new society or a new. Yeah, that's fascinating. So yeah, I don't think I was super aware of that. How did it all end? How did your involvement end? How did this square end up being like cleared?
Yeah.
What's the...
Sure. Yeah. And so one way that I would frame it now, looking back on it, was, and I had a great conversation again with my friend Richard Bartlett on my podcast that talked about Occupy Wall Street as a kind of bootstrapping collective intelligence. And so what it was trying to do was to create a sort of insurgent culture that was itself a sort of intelligence that could solve problems better than the political system that currently exists, which is actually both a low bar and I think a much higher bar than we thought at the time, being kids and quite naive. And so certain nodes within the dominant system were very aware of the threat that something like this could escalate into. The Arab Spring had happened. And there was a time on the planet when governments were being toppled, and certainly there was a lot of folks in Occupy who thought that was what the point was. And there was a week or two, I don't remember exactly, but when a coordinated effort of state and federal institutions basically just closed down the camps. I and most of my friends got arrested. We got thrown in jail, of me for just 36 hours. All of the charges were thrown out subsequently, but the camp itself was totally destroyed. We continued to organize. We had lots of resources by this time, hundreds of thousands of dollars, tons of food, people in the city giving us housing and warehouse space and everything else. So we continued to organize, but without the actual encampment, the energy started to dissipate. Infighting grew. There's good reason to suspect that there were certain people who were participating in the movement who were in fact bad actors, or bad actors relative to the movement, agents or whatever. And one of the reasons why inclusive consensus-based movements don't work is because they're extremely easy to infiltrate, as you might imagine. And if listeners or you don't know, the way that consensus works is that anybody can block a proposal.
Right.
Anybody can just completely shut down any proposal.
Yeah.
So it's, again, naive. There's a bunch of naivete there. The way that I ended up leaving the movement was by trying to create structures through which we could exclude people from the movement. So that was the hill that I decided to die on, apparently, not knowing that would be what would happen when I started to try to make that happen. But of course, me doing that became a lightning rod for both everybody who was extremely attached to the idea of inclusivity as like a kind of value, but then also all of the agents. So all the people that we suspected were in fact, federal agents or people from like conservative news organizations or whatever, all came to the meeting where I was trying to make a proposal to try to kick them out. It just blew up in a horrible way and caused me immense amounts of psychological pain. I remember like crying, and my mentor at the time was just trying to console me, and shortly after my heart broke and I couldn't keep participating. By that time I was also physically exhausted and burnt out, and just I had to go.
Yeah. And it again sounds similar to some stories that I hear from like Burning Man. And or someone that really was trying to do something, and it could go really when it's unmediated by law and hierarchy. It has some wonderful qualities, and it also can have really chaotic, painful, destructive qualities, which I'm guessing is why we created these hierarchies and structures in the first place, because we probably had giant tribes that had issues. So is there something you took from that experience, both in terms of relationships or in terms of kind of a to-do, like a personal to-do list for the future, anything that you took from that you carried with you forward?
I think it was part of how it was very, I think, formative for me was in, let's say, like kind of crushing some of this idealism or this naivete around inclusivity. Fundamentally, that inclusivity without the balance of like other values and standards and systems becomes a disvalue, becomes it actually becomes toxic to the success of projects. And that was really important for my own kind of wayfinding in terms of organizational structures and how I think about movement building and how I think about hierarchy and things like that. In terms of relationships, there's lots of folks that I'm still friends with, and my life is absolutely was completely and permanently altered, the trajectory of my life by that experience. I got my job at Buddhist Geeks, I think in large part because Vince Horn, the creator of Buddhist Geeks, was like, whoa, that's really cool that you did that. I sort of wanted that energy and that kind of experience as part of what he was creating. It's funny, at the time that I, quote unquote, joined up with Occupy Wall Street, I very consciously thought that I was choosing like insecurity and discomfort and a lack of success in terms of work or whatever to do this thing that I thought was good and true and beautiful. And in fact, subsequent to that, it's been my portal to every kind of success and opportunity that I've had. People look at that on my resume and they're like, oh, cool. That's really like awesome that you did that. And that's really great. Yeah. It was funny. That's how it worked out in retrospect.
I often find that when you do something authentic and real, that even that you see no relationship to how it can contribute in the future, that usually is the thing that opens doors later on. It's amazing.
It is amazing. It's wonderful that has worked out, at least for me. And a lot of the folks that I know, my friends, true, that those, like you say, those chances they took really paid off.
So tell me about Buddhist Geeks, which is how we got to meet each other. I'll let you introduce it because I don't think people necessarily know it who listen to this podcast. And then how you got involved with it.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I know this is going to sound very silly, but it was so important for my own like world building that I just assumed that everybody also knows about Buddhist Geeks. It was so central to my life for a period of time. But Buddhist Geeks was, and that's obviously not true, but Buddhist Geeks was this podcast in the early days of podcasting that was all about like, what do you say, like millennial Buddhism or the integration of technology, culture, and Buddhism. There are conversations that Vince had about scientific studies of mindfulness. This was in the early days of that too, or more speculative stuff about contemplative technologies that might accelerate the progress of learning meditation or becoming an enlightened person, which were really cool to me, or poking at different more modern ethical issues, sexuality or gender stuff. And, just all of that was just put under the umbrella of taking like a kind of Buddhist perspective and all the stuff I already cared about. It was already up for me as like a young person growing up on the internet. And it was super nerdy, and Vince was a huge geek and was really into tech. And it was, for me, it was a kind of conversations that weren't happening anywhere else. And they totally captured me, totally inspired me, totally informed the way that I think about practice, that I think about my life, that I relate to what the point of Buddhism is, what the point of spirituality is, all of that. Yeah.
It was, as someone, I think I started meditating in 2011 or maybe, it was probably 11. And discovering this podcast was everything. It was by far the best resource, and I think it's still out there. Go listen. But just wonderful, deep conversations with wonderful, deep thinkers from every walks of Buddhism, and scientists who study Buddhism, and I study meditation and mindfulness and like meditation apps before it was a big thing. And I think to this day, it's probably the podcast that I was most loyal to. Unfortunately, it's not super active these days, but then I reached out to Vince to ask a question, and we got talking, and then he told me about this. I ended up doing a retreat with Vince, like an online retreat.
Oh, right on.
But yeah, so how did you get involved? What was the process?
I think he put a call out somewhere for volunteers for transcribing episodes or something like that, some kind of like very low level task. And I responded to it, and I actually did the thing, which it turns out in the world of the internet is actually quite rare, to put out like a request for volunteer assistance and then have somebody do the thing competently. And so that was, we started talking, and then we connected and continued to connect, and he implied that if I were in Boulder, that maybe I could get a job at Buddhist Geeks. And so after Occupy, I moved to Boulder, where my then girlfriend had moved as well. And so it worked out, and I was there, and I just kept hanging out with him until he offered me a job, and I leapt at that and worked there for 3 years, and it was an amazing experience because I had heard his voice in my head for hundreds of hours. He was like a hero to me, having all these conversations that totally changed my life. And so the opportunity to then work with him and learn with him, and it was like a dream come true, really.
Yeah. So you worked, I didn't know that you were actually, I assumed that you were just a decentralized team. So you were in the same
Boulder,
place.
yeah. We would meet every week up at his apartment, his and Emily's apartment. Yeah, it was so fun. Yeah.
Cool. And you were doing, at the time, there was like a Google Plus group.
Yeah. The Buddhist Geeks community. We did a lot of work. We found that Google Plus, we were like, that's the platform. Of course, probably a lot of people listening maybe only remember Google Plus. It was pretty short lived, but partly we chose that because of its integration with Google Hangouts. And so the online community was one of the first sort of video based communities where people would actually schedule these discussion groups and these practice groups that they would, like a Zoom call, be together live with each other. Which I designed based on my experience at Occupy Wall Street. We did a particular structure called open space technology, where people could propose things and then create groups based on their proposed schedule. And
that was awesome. And there were also these standing meditation rooms that you could just walk into on Google Meet, and someone would be there meditating.
It was so fun because we had to create a dummy computer that would always host the Hangouts, because you couldn't at that point have an empty Hangout room. Somebody had to host it. So we created the Buddhist Geeks robot, who would spin up a Hangouts room so that people could come in.
Awesome.
And we created like a digital image of an altar that people could like look at.
Yeah,
I remember this now. Yeah, it was so fun.
That's awesome. That's really awesome.
It was so fun. It was so fun. I loved it. And we learned so much. And it was great. It still exists. It turned into what is now called the Dharma Mechanics community, which is a relatively small but extremely vibrant online Buddhist community that has integrated many of the structures that we prototyped in the Buddhist Geeks community. And it's fascinating. Like I lost track of it for a while, but about 6 months ago, the steward of it reached out to me, and somebody that I was friends with from the Buddhist Geeks community, and kind of was like, hey, you should really check this out. And they just continued doing it, but with all volunteer completely volunteer led. There's no kind of part of the reason why the Buddhist Geeks community dissolved was because of money issues. Like we couldn't find a way to make it monetizable in the way that it needed to be. It continued on, and it brings me great joy to see that they are still exploring in the way that we set up the context for it. There's differences too, but that community wouldn't be here without the work that we did.
Cool. Yeah. Send me a link. I'm super interested. And are you in touch with Vince at all?
Oh yeah, totally. We talk maybe like once a month or more often. Yeah. He is teaching full time, and he has like a really awesome collection of courses that he teaches that are refinement of a lot of the technical discussions that were happening with Buddhist Geeks in the early days with Kenneth Folk and Daniel Ingram, and taking these things like social noting and really refining it and turning it into a whole body of practice, and mashing up things like design thinking and meditation to create, they call it responsive meditation, where they learn what your needs are and then design suites of techniques to try to meet those needs, and, you know, dynamically constructed retreats and all that kind of good stuff. So there's that element. So they have a really strong, and I think it's quite successful now, online teaching component. And now they're also raising money, although I'm sure this has been a little bit disrupted because of COVID, but they're raising money for what they call the Buddhist Geeks Farm, which is it is also a kind of an experiment with a sort of neo-monasticism where they have a shared schedule and they practice together. It's like much more chill. There's a lot more free time and time to work, do your own work, presumably on a computer and things like that. But the idea of an intentional community coming together for the sake of awakening and all that kind of good stuff. And that's a physical community. I think, so Vince spends a lot of time like learning to farm and things like that now.
I have a friend who has a permaculture farm up in Maine, and I'm so jealous. Nice. I'm so jealous of, but I'm kind of an spoiled urban guy a little bit. Let's talk about, because I think you spent time in these urban monastic, both in and engage in making these different environments for us to inhabit, for us to live in and practice in. And you talked before about alienation, and I think it's something that a lot of people have to feel. I definitely feel that there's something broken with the way we live in the modern world, in this isolation we experience. And the most recent example is I did do a retreat up north in Israel and came back. First of all, this is my first real physical retreat experience, and it was mind-blowing. But I came back home, and it was a silent retreat, and we were a lot of people in a room. I came back home, and I looked at my apartment, and I said, 10 or 15 people missing from this space. There's just me in all of this space. We're not supposed to live this way. And if I want to talk to someone, realistically speaking, you don't talk to your neighbors here that much. Realistically speaking, I'd have to go to my office to find anyone that I can actually have a conversation with. So how do you engage with, how do you think about the way we live, modern isolation, and then what were your attempts to play with it and change it?
So I found myself living in community, like quote unquote pseudo-intentional community, in my sophomore year in college. And really from that, it was a group house. It was where we had a loose shared interest in cooking food. Basically, that was it. You just needed an excuse to create a community house on the campus. And from that time, it was just immediately clear that living with other people, as you say, like it's a better way to live. That atomized, especially if you're living alone in an apartment or living by yourself. And I'm not even sure nuclear family is that much better, frankly, but this living alone is just a disaster. It's not how humans are meant to live. And so since then, I've lived in yoga centers and meditation centers, 2 different co-ops. I occupy Wall Street, and then now live at the Monastic Academy, which is the most like intensive experience of community that I've ever experienced.
It might not be obvious. This is so hard to explain. And I have good friends that that would say, yeah, I love living by myself. Everything's fine. What are you talking about?
Mm-hmm. What comes up first is, I don't know how other people are. Maybe for some people it is totally fine. I totally down with that. Whatever works for an individual. It's hard to, you got to go spend some time in a community. Like, try it out. I think it's one of those things that we at least in American culture, and I think it's a lot in a lot of modern culture, like we just take it for granted. Of course you live in an apartment by yourself. Of course you don't know your neighbors. Of course you live in a one-family household. But that's completely ahistorical. So maybe learn a little bit about the effects of loneliness, the effects of not getting enough platonic touch, which I think is actually extremely significant in terms of how it constellates like all kinds of other disorders that ride on top of a lack of physical intimacy. I'm not talking about sex. I'm talking about just like holding hands and like cuddling with people and like just, just like normal physical intimacy. If you go to a lot of countries, you just see people just engaging in all the time, but not so much here. So you kind of just trouble that narrative that this is normal and expected. And then once you feel ready, just walk into a community, a functional, intentional community, a functional community house, whatever it is, and just notice how your body starts to feel in that space. In here to the Monastic Academy, and we say we can explain this whole thing to you until we turn blue in the face. We can spend hours, and I love talking about it. We spend hours talking about it. But the moment that you walk through the doors, you will understand it in a way that no amount of conversating about it would ever accomplish. And it's so big. We are not individuals. Fundamentally, we are not individuals. We are context. We arise in a context. And so when you enter into a different context, a different system that's deliberately designed for, in this case, human flourishing, you feel it. You know, you might not even know what is going on. You might not be able to conceptualize it, but you feel it. And so my recommendation would be like, if you can open a wedge of possibility, maybe by learning about the historically contingent nature of the way that we structure our dwellings and like the consequences of like loneliness and lack of physical touch and all these things, then maybe that will inspire you to actually step foot in a place where they do it differently. And then once you're there, just see how it is for you. See if it feels nice.
What it brings up. Yeah. The first thing I see is and I've known people now who've lived in communes and shared housing, then urban kibbutz. In Israel, there's this idea of an urban kibbutz, which is like a collective housing with shared amenities. They seem more comfortable in their own skin, more happy, less anxious, less depressed. And there's so many, and for myself, I know that there's times in my life when I was in Thailand in a guest house, surrounded by young people from all over the world, like playing the guitar or doing something by the fire or whatever. There's the body says,
totally,
yeah, this is normal. And then, or in the retreat, it feels like the body for the first time says, this is what life should be. Like you've been starved and you don't even know it. So how do you think? So I have one friend in specific in mind when I ask this question, but I'm sure it applies to a lot of people. What if someone says, "But I'm not a very social person. I'm shy. I'm an introvert. Spending too much time with other people makes me nervous, makes me tired, makes me." So are these people also doing well in these settings, or what would you say to that?
Yeah. So one is there's a phrase I heard from this thinker I really like, Jordan Hall. He says, it's really important to remember that human beings are obligate tribal, right? Like biologically, we are tribal creatures.
Right.
So if you're into like paleo diets or whatever, if you think like we should design our lives according to our biology, we should be suspicious of people another way of putting it is sometimes people say to me, I just don't like dancing. And I'm like, do you really not like dancing, or have you just not learned yet how to enjoy dancing? Because in fact, dancing feels good. In fact, it feels good to dance.
Or is it that you have built extra layers of insecurity and self-judgment and whatever that's
Exactly.
preventing
You need to
you
unlearn.
from...
You need to unlearn your way into feeling good about dancing. And so there's a kind of similar thing when it comes to living in community, I think, ultimately. On a more near term, like in a more kind of like superficial layer, yeah, totally. I'm introverted. I like spending time alone. Maybe that's why I've ended up in a community where we all sit together in silence for a couple hours every day. I don't know. But even when I lived in a co-op where we didn't all meditate together, I had my own room, even though the kitchen was shared and the dining room was shared. Typically in a lot of these places, you have your own room. You can retreat, you can be quiet, and there's so many different flavors of intentionally designed community that have different places in the spectrum in terms of like always with other people versus like lots like more private space, more time alone. Like there's co-housing, there's just a totally rich world of different sorts of designs for this. And so I would say, like, to that person, be open to the idea that you could change. You could become a person who really feels comfortable and actually thrives in relationship with other people. And that might be actually how you as an organism are designed to be. And also, it's not like you're always with other people in these sorts of spaces. There's downtime. Yeah.
There's plenty of personal space. Interesting. So I think I could have a conversation with you all day about this. So you've experienced a lot of these different ways of living. And so I actually do want to get into where you live now and how that works, but maybe talk to us about, as an evolution of ways of living, what are you seeing out there? Like where are innovations happening? Where do you think there's room for innovation? Where do you see it's going? What are some of your thoughts for what's going on?
Yeah, as you say, I think there is this kind of sense, like in so many other aspects of our culture, that like this is a kind of broken thing, like that the atomized living is broken, and this whole space of innovation and potential there then that opens up once you see that. And I'm more familiar with the more traditionally intentional community space. And specifically, like my area of study now is much more having to do with like kind of neo-monastic communities of practice where there's a sort of shared ethos and ecology of transformational practices. And in that area, probably now close to once a month, somebody reaches out to me talking about a community like that they're trying to start, whether it's in Berlin or in Ireland or somewhere in America. And so there's the kind of huge global planetary movement of just people investigating in ulterior ways of living together. And there's my kind of particular part of the pie that I'm especially passionate about, which is this kind of like experimenting with transformational educational containers where we all opt in to a shared sort of practice. And yeah, it's fascinating to me that this is happening now. I think it's really beautiful.
Yeah. And I think it's one of the more hopeful things that are going on in the world today. And let's talk about this balance or this range of possibilities between a monastery, like a Buddhist monastery, or some sort of the more loose intentional community, and what are the different options? So I actually, you know what, let's make this as shallow and selfish as I can make it. I'm in the market for, let's say I'm in the market for a community, a different way of living. What's available to me in the world today as different types of formats?
Totally. Well, I'm definitely not like an expert in this field. The sort of general types or categories of places that you could look into are, one is cooperative housing. And that is usually in a more urban or suburban environment where you're all like have individual rooms, share a kitchen, usually a kind of light shared ethos, usually around like being a kind of chosen family and living together. That's pretty light in terms of commitment. Often these communities have like rolling admissions and people are often coming and going, in my experience. I've lived in a couple of these. Then you have like co-housing, which I think is a fascinating movement where, and this takes a lot more deliberate zoning policy and kind of a resource to set up, but you have private dwellings located like near each other on a plot of land with often a shared central space with a big kitchen and amenities and maybe a gym and a place to eat together. That is where a lot of, and I think rightly so, a lot of energy and attention is going because of the kind of balance of privacy and sociality, pro-sociality. And so those are, as far as I'm aware, like two of the more mainstream options for people. They're often in urban environments or near cities. And then there's like the whole part of the spectrum that's like weird, experimental, intentional communities that are all the way from really like your friend in Maine who has a kind of permaculture community where there's a lot of focus on cultivating the land, all the way to cutting edge cults, various kinds. There's a whole movement. When I say neo-monastic communities within that, and this is a focus of discussion, like in my media space, like where my podcast has been, is like that also means there's a lot of cults that are emerging now. Like just like in the 60s, there's a lot of like problematic actors, unethical religious communities. So there's like religious intentional communities. There's much more practical intentional communities like permaculture or people who are just preparing for collapse. That's a whole world. Then there's just like all the colors of the rainbow in between. And there's places like Twin Oaks, which would be a great place to look at. I think it's in, I want to say Ohio or Iowa in the US, where it's in a county that has some kind of special tax break or tax system. And so there's about a half dozen or more of these intentional communities, some of which have been there since the 60s, which are much more about like income sharing. And so they have, in the case of Twin Oaks, they make soy and hammocks, and everybody that lives there works either in that or helping to keep the community alive. Everybody's given a stipend, but they share everything basically. It's much more of a commune. I think that's probably more similar to some of the more like traditional kibbutzes.
Soy and hammocks. That sounds perfect.
I know, it's
that's
such a classic.
Need.
Yeah. Apparently the reason why they're so successful, because they're one of the few communities from the 60s that survived, is because Pier 1 bought all their hammocks. They used to be the only hammock supplier for Pier 1, and Whole Foods picked up their soy products, right? So
those are good hammocks too.
Yeah. I think they go for $150 a pop. So they're serious business stuff. And so, one of the trends is also that all these communities that started in the 60s, most of if they survived, which very few of them did, I think that I read an article, they have a lower success rate than startups, right? So like most intentional communities fail after some number of years, but the ones that did survive now are either now dissolving or having to find some way of passing the torch to the next generation, which is a very complicated move, whether it be in a religious system or in just a kind of more intentional community. But Twin Oaks is a really strong one. And so there's a huge variation. I can send you, there's a kind of a website that categorizes all of the intentional communities in the world. So if you want, I can send you that, and it will give you, you can just spend months and months just
I'd love that, and I'll put the link in the show notes too for anyone who's interested. So tell me about the monastic academy and what's going on in there.
Sure. So the way I like to frame it, which is not the way how it's always framed, but it's something like this is an experiment in post-traditional contemplative community. So we're not like traditionally Buddhist, religiously Buddhist. We take from a lot of different traditions, so we're kind of syncretic in that sense, including like kind of more postmodern practices like circling or versions of trauma healing. Like we do a trauma healing practice here that's quite modern, created in the last 10 years. And there's about 24 people that live here in northern Vermont, and we live here full time. The people who live here run the nonprofit. So part of the training here is to run the nonprofit, and we eat, work, sleep, practice with each other. It's like full on. It's about as full on as it could be. One way that I've heard the founder talk about it's actually quite similar to the Army, right? Like it's in terms of its intensity and the all-inness and the rigor, right? Like you show up to everything on time. There's a very particular way that we do meals. There's a very kind of formalized process for lots of the aspects of life here. But whereas the Army is trying to armor you, turn you into this weapon.
Yeah.
This place is all about de-armoring you. It's all about softening you and liberating you from your stuckness. And we have a shared ethos. We have a shared kind of body of practices. And so it's a very unique and, for me, very special place.
Yeah. And I can imagine some people listening to this thinking about all these rules and restrictions and thinking, oh, it's so restrictive. But if you've ever been in an army setting or in a monastic setting or in a retreat setting, you know that it's the opposite, that it's the most liberating thing, because everything, you don't have to think about any. You wake up when the bell rings, you do what everybody tells you to do. And actually you have a lot of freedom. You're like, should I have my tea now or wait after meditation? Like, I have 5 minutes now, but everything else in between, there's no noise, there's no anxiety about what you should be doing.
Yes. Yeah. One of the things, Soryu Foral is the person who founded this place, amazing human being, incredible meditation teacher. And he says that many people believe that getting what you want or doing what you want is freedom. But in fact, getting what you want, doing what you want is just enslavement to what you want. You're just doing the thing that you want. You're just doing what you want tells you to do. Is that freedom?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
How did you
You're following your desires?
Yeah. How did you come to what you want? Why do you want what you want? So it's a very different kind of take on freedom, what freedom is, for sure.
Yeah. And there's also this idea of freedom from and freedom to, right? If in a retreat you have freedom to think about topics deeply, you have freedom to be with other people, you have freedom to appreciate nature often, and you have freedom from distraction, freedom from the noise of the outside most of the time, but you don't have freedom from rules, right? And you don't have freedom to do whatever you want at any time.
Yeah. And
it's a trade-off.
Well, it's a trade-off, but also, like, in fact, choices don't make you happy. Like, we know this. Like, the science of happiness is very clear about this. So when you walk into a grocery store and there's 50 kinds of chips, that does not contribute to your happiness. There's a reason why Steve Jobs wore the same outfit every day. It's just, there's just so much joy in not making decisions, or by reallocating all of your choice making into those areas of life which are actually important, of which kind of chip to buy is not one of them. Right? What is actually important? That is what you should be spending your energy on, not what you wear, not like even what you're doing with your time, actually. Unless you, because when left to my own devices, I do not spend my time. I don't, right? Don't reliably anyways.
Yeah, no, I would say the same thing. I never regret being in a more strict environment. But when I look at it from the outside, I always hesitate jumping in quite a bit.
Yeah, same here.
But once I'm in, it actually is a lot of, and I think that's probably why people stay in big companies or stay in, like, there's structure that you don't have to think. And as entrepreneurs, we have this ethos of the heroic founder who makes his own decisions. And I still buy into that. I have to say, I still buy into that quite a bit. But I also know that unless I'm trying to do something actually good in the world and make more of a difference than I would in a big company, big company life is more natural in a way. Like, it's more structured, it's more, or big, whatever, academia, whatever system. Belonging to an existing system is easier.
Right.
Easier and healthier in some ways.
I think you're right. As long as you can find a system that you trust. Right. If you have to live in service of a system that you don't actually trust, then it destroys your soul. Yeah,
I think that's probably true. So thinking about systems and how much you can trust them, I saw this hilarious thing. You're actually in the news a couple of months ago.
That's right. Yeah.
Meet the man who went on a 75-day retreat and missed the pandemic.
Yeah.
And then they interview you. It was hilarious. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, it's basically what the headline says. I went into retreat the day after the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic, and then was in retreat for 75 days. I wasn't following everything that happened from mid-March until the end of May.
Right.
And I came back out, and the New York Times interviewed me. I think I posted jokingly, I posted on Twitter, I've been gone for 75 days. Did I miss anything? Which got a lot of attention. And then, I got interviewed by the New York Times, and I got picked up by a lot of different news organizations. And
yeah, that's hilarious.
Yeah.
But also it shows you the freedom. Imagine being in a place so quiet and so isolated and so protected that you can spend time with your own internal processes and nature and whatever. And this is how you used to live. This is how all of us used to live 1,000 years ago. Like nobody, unless it happened in your immediate environment, you wouldn't know about it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And there's something almost beautiful about it. Like it really is the most press for a pandemic ever, and most obsession with a pandemic ever. And in some ways it's good, because we probably saved a lot of lives by doing that, and we probably sped up a lot of processes to creating a vaccine and all that. But at the same time, think about all the anguish. If you actually measure the suffering time of everyone because of the news cycle.
Yeah. I don't regret being in retreat for a moment. I'm so happy that was where I was at that time. And I don't know what to say about that. And the funny thing, and I actually did an interview with a friend of mine for this media project called Rebel Wisdom, who knew me and my work with my podcast. And to a large degree, I had moved to the monastic academy because I was aware of the potential for things like a global pandemic. I positioned myself in an intentional community in rural Vermont because I was very concerned about the potential for systemic breakdowns of various kinds. And so it was funny that the article cast me as this sort of, oh, what's happening? Where but in fact, I had been following COVID before I went in. I had helped draft the policy about it for the monastic academy, and it was on retreat so that I could, in fact, be a person who is capable of responding in times of crisis in a more trustworthy way. Yeah, it was a very strange thing to come out of retreat and be the focus of the planetary media system. It's a very strange experience for sure. Yeah.
And it's also, I'm sure it made people smile, and I'm sure it made their day a little bit better. So that's spreading the happiness a little bit.
Yeah.
Just to even stop and think for a moment that you could have been gone for 2 months and not be part of it. Pretty encouraging.
Yeah.
So let's talk about your podcast and Emerge. How did it? So first of all, there's some similarities between Emerge and Remake. I think Remake is a little bit more active sounding, and Emerge is more like, let's observe what's happening. But we're both asking ourselves some of the same questions. And so how did that get, and you've been doing this for way, way longer. And so how did it get started? What was the experience with it? And then I know you put it on semi-hold, so I would love to hear the whole arc of it.
Totally. Yeah. So it started, there were two things that were happening. One, I was talking a lot with Vince Horn actually, and because he was getting a little bit, I'd say bored or disenchanted with Buddhist Geeks and that project. And we were both feeling into other conversations that might take place. And through that process, it became clear to me that there were these conversations that I really wanted to have that nobody else was having. And I was actually waiting for somebody to start having. And then it just clicked. Oh, I could host a podcast. There's no reason why I can't host a podcast. And I think for me, like for you, podcasts have been a very formative and important media, part of my information diet, and really part of my education as a human. And I just started talking to people that I was interested in. And part of the reason I chose the frame of Emerge was that I had seen Vince go through this process of disillusionment where he was like, I don't want to talk about Buddhism anymore. Right. And so he was constrained to a certain degree by the brand that he had selected. Yeah. So I wanted to select a brand that could contain me no matter where my explorations took me. And so that's why I chose the framing of emerge and emergence, this idea of something novel happening through the interplay of different aspects or different objects. Something just emerges into existence. And also this idea of what is emerging, what's on the kind of cutting edge of the collective consciousness, like what's happening now. And so I talk to people in the blockchain world and in Extinction Rebellion and really awesome philosophers who are exploring like the really far reaches of consciousness, like Rob Burbea and his soul-making Dharma, or people like Daniel Schmachtenberger and Jordan Hall, a little bit before they became more well-known. They're now, my podcast was one of the first in a space in which there are now many different media projects that are exploring this same weird sort of emergent consciousness and systems transformation space. And in a lot of ways, it was the child of Buddhist Geeks. Vince and I both acknowledge that now, that like in the lineage of Buddhist Geeks is my podcast. And it also started because I just wanted to have intellectual conversations that I wasn't able to have in the monastery when I was living here. And so it was a kind of outlet for me. I also, the summer in which it got quite big, like it got a lot of listeners, was when I had invested in Ethereum relatively early. And so I had a good amount of money. I didn't have to work for a while. And so I just spent most of my time just like learning and following threads on social networks and intuitively identifying central nodes in this sort of like emerging planetary network of people who are thinking in a very like orthogonal but sophisticated way about how to define the problems facing the planet and then how to solve them. And so it got into territories of like collective intelligence and like generator functions and systems theory and just this whole interesting collection of topics that I don't think I hadn't seen brought together before. And so it made a lot of connections for me and I think for listeners too. Yeah.
And these are all super interesting topics, from the fairly well known to the completely esoteric, but they all are really engaging with large problems in really fascinating ways. So definitely recommend people check it out. And yeah, like I think there's something that comes with practice, that some way in which your way of seeing the world changes and things feel less rigid and more dynamic and interdependent and dependent, and it's very hard to look at it and not see both the possibilities and the dangers of this balance that we're in, that's not actually a stable balance. And systems thinking plays into it, because you're seeing things as more complex, interdependent systems as just like objects.
Yes.
And you're definitely one of these people who took it further and had these conversations, and it's super good job. And so what made you stop having these conversations as regularly?
So there are a couple factors. One was it is this sort of drying up of the passion for it. Right? Like I think one of the things that is part of how I look at the world is that I kind of trust passion. I trust curiosity is like pulling me towards something that is trustworthy. It's fundamentally trustworthy. And it was drying up, and I was super curious about that. And I had a lot of tension with it because I could have, and still could, but I don't know if I will, make the leap to a passive income or lifestyle business using this brand. And as a precariat millennial, I was definitely like, am I really going to just like let this die on the vine because of my values. Like, really? Like, it seems like a very bad idea. So one part of it was this kind of tension of, it just doesn't seem like there's much passion here. So that was a big part of it. Another part was that, like I said, that a lot of other projects had started to emerge in the same space that were exploring the same territory. And I felt, to some degree, I played a part in inspiring this space to come into being. And now I'm not as needed here. So I don't know if that's really where I need to spend my time. But then the nail in the coffin, in fact, was my 75-day retreat, followed by a conversation with this incredible human being named Zach Stein, where we focused on this topic of social media and media more generally, and to what degree participating in these mediums and these spaces, in fact, debases your capacity to show up for the people in your life that you care for. And to what degree is it a trade-off? Like, my participation in this sort of conversational digital space, to what degree because I'm showing up there, does it make it harder for me to be here for the people I love in my community? And so as I to lean into that, I was presented with a kind of values choice. And I think partly because I could see more clearly what was conducive to happiness coming out of my long retreat, it tipped the scales. And I decided, at least for a time being, I'm just going to step back from participating in the internet so much. Like, I shut down my Facebook account. I stopped posting on Twitter, and have just poured more of myself into this community here at the Monastic Academy. Yeah. That being said, I do definitely feel like there's something deep in me that's roiling, like preparing certain conversations. Like, I look forward to doing it more, but I think it's nice to not be doing it for some time.
Yeah. Yeah, it takes a lot of it out of you. I've only been doing this for a couple months, but just even to, first of all, to find the right people, and then you have to immerse yourself in their life and their world to be prepared to have a decent conversation, and then you go into edit mode. At least for me, that's a big deal, and your life is half over from that. Like,
totally, yeah. And also, like, with the podcast world, like, there's a kind of expectation to publish every week. That's what all the sites tell you, like the strategy sites. So, like,
trying to do it,
you gotta publish every week. And it's, holy shit, the conversations I had on my podcast Emerge were so dense. Like, any one of them I could have studied and picked apart and felt into for weeks. And so, like, what? Let's just chill. Let's just chill a little bit. Do we need more information? Do we really need more information? I don't. Like, and so that's the other part. Like, the obstacle to my development, my well-being, is not more information. It's not.
Yeah. You know? No, I think that's definitely right. For
some people it is. For some people it is. For some people it definitely is. But for me, it's not. Yeah.
There's this physicist who wrote about the emergence of life and proved, I forget his name, he's probably in MIT or something, that proved that if you apply a steady income of energy investment over time coming from the sun, it bounds to create increasingly complex structures. That kind of explains life. But it has to come at a specific rate. If there's too much energy, then structures, it's just too much energy in the system, too much chaos, structures won't emerge. If it's too little, then it will just stagnate. It won't keep growing. But if it's a certain band, you can create complexity. And I'm all for complexity. And so if you give me a steady stream of information that constantly is making me more complex, without getting into the territory of chaos, of destruction, and without stagnation, so without me being like in my own head all the time with only my own thoughts, I need some input.
So I talked, one of the interviews I had was with this person, Tom Murray, fascinating character. And he created this model that he calls the wisdom skills model. And he's very into adult developmental psychology. And he's also into like more contemplative practice and meditation and stuff like that. And he plots it as that you want to do both. You want to build more complexity, and you need to be able to release complexity. You need to enter into spaces where it's just all let go of. It's just completely let go of. You're actually ablating, you're deleting, you're getting rid of, you're letting go, you're decomplexifying. And that those ought to exist in a kind of harmony whereby the complexity, the complexifying gives you more motivation to let go, and the letting go gives space for a more trustworthy complexifying. Because part of the problem with our world today is that we build complexity as if that were like good in and of itself, when in fact, oftentimes complexity, if it's based in delusion or based in ignorance or whatever, you're just that's a recipe for on a large scale planetary destruction, on a small scale just misery.
So complexity without harmony or without balance,
without releasing it, periodically releasing complexity. Like my sense and my read, and part of the reason why I was like, all right, I've had enough conversations, I'm going to actually just really throw myself into meditative practice, that the solution, at least for me in my life, what I'm throwing my chips in for is that the solution is actually down the stack. It's down the stack. It's something prior to all of our ideas. It's prior to all of the complexity that we as human beings with our prefrontal cortexes add to life. The solution is something prior to that, more so than it's actually complexity. We're very good at making things complicated and complex. We're very good at that. I don't think we know so well how to do the other move. It's much harder for us. We're so addicted to making things complex.
That's really interesting. And so the full name, so this place where you're in, and this is maybe the last kind of question for you, is Maple, right? It's in Vermont. And the full name is the Monastic Academy for the Preservation of Life on Earth, which is quite a big name. So tell us a little bit about the mission there and how you view how it is put together, what makes it special.
Yes. Part of what brought me back to Maple, because I had lived here for about 2 years previously, from like 2014 to 2016. And when I was here before, it was really just for the sake of meditation. I wanted to get better at meditation. And when I came here, the founder, Soryu, would often talk about how essentially human beings were destroying life on Earth. We were participating in life in such a way that we were headed off a cliff. We were creating the conditions for the destruction of life. And I knew this was true. We're in the 5th mass extinction. Things are bad. We're destroying ecosystems, destroying biodiversity, so on. But it wasn't really like motivating me. I then left, and in one of the threads in the conversations I had on my podcast was with people who had been studying this topic of systems collapse, planetary collapse very closely. And in conversation with them, I had much more conviction that what Soryu had been saying was true. We are in a very dangerous time. We are likely past the point of no return in terms of whether or not the system that currently exists that, brings our food to our grocery stores and make sure our paycheck can be turned in for money at the bank, so on and so forth. It's not looking good for that system. And so the diagnosis of Maple is that the thing which all of the various kind of individual, cultural, and systemic traits and behaviors that are actively constituting dynamics that are leading towards the destruction of life, all of those have their roots in the human mind. That it's a certain human mind, a type of human mind, specifically that kind of human mind that is motivated by greed, hatred, and ignorance or delusion, that when given too much power through the use of things like exponential technology, destroys and debases the biosystems on which it depends. And so the purpose of the monastic academy is to train us, educate us into discovering a new mind that doesn't create these problems and in fact resolves them through the way that it participates in life and in the world. And the sort of long-term solution is, like, create many of these communities such that over time they can actually influence and inform culture by demonstrating a different way of being that is more humane because you're living in community. It's more in integrity. It's more conducive to true joy and happiness and freedom. And so that people say, oh, we don't have to live in this way that is destroying the planet. We can, in fact, do this other thing that's very nice and good. And even though on the face of it looks like a big compromise because you're not that everybody's going to be in a monastery, but that this will inform how we think about what it means to be alive and all that. And so there's already 3 instances of the monastic academy. There's one outside of Toronto, there's one in California, and we're planning on there being many more. And I think of it as like a new kind of education. It's training us how to be good stewards of the planet, how to be people who aren't and are unwilling to compromise in terms of how they live, such that they are like actively participating in the destruction of the planet.
Yeah, that's definitely a worthwhile cause. And this brings to mind when I was writing my thesis. I'm writing my thesis about Buddhism or Buddhist philosophy and AI, and how to write AI, how to be informed by Buddhist ideas when creating wise AI. Yeah. And one of the main sources is Masahiro Mori, who is a famous roboticist. He invented the term uncanny valley, which a lot of people have heard. Yeah. And he also wrote a book, The Buddha and the Robot. And one of his most powerful statements in this book is, technology is making us more and more powerful.
Yes.
But humans are not getting better and better.
That's right.
As our minds are not getting wiser.
That's right.
And furthermore, even if you look at human beings optimistically, we don't usually reach wisdom until later in life. And so most of our lives we spend in less than ideal conditions. And he said, basically the only hope I see is if somehow, because right now it's a negative reinforcing loop, because technology is getting more powerful. We are not getting any wiser, so we're going to do more and more damage.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
And so he said the only way to fix it that he saw was to build technology that made men better.
Yes.
Because that will fix the loop.
Yes. Yeah. And I would even go further and say that, in fact, the technology we're building these days is downgrading human capacities. Yeah. Like you look at social media, right? It's like decreasing wisdom and love and increasing division. In some ways, it increases awareness to very important issues that we weren't aware of before. But in other ways, it's making us sometimes less empathetic and more enraged and less. I would guess I would think it has some positives. Yeah.
Maybe like podcasts. I would put podcasts solidly in the column of thinking more deeply about issues and being better informed.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I think there's definitely ways to use these tools that amplify wisdom and love, but I would have to be convinced that they weren't, in general, dampening them and debasing them. But I'd love to be convinced otherwise, actually, because it's one of the more depressing things is when I consider what social media is doing to the brains and social networks of young people. It's pretty... Anyways,
it's depressing. Yeah.
But that's exactly what you quoted in terms of the way that we frame it, is that we have these 3 capacities of wisdom, love, and power, and we have more and more power. But if we don't marshal the power of gods with the wisdom and love of gods, then we're doomed as a species.
Yeah.
And so we need to find ways to upregulate our wisdom and love to accord with our exponential increase in power or self-terminating. and the clock is ticking. And so we really need to move quickly to do that. And so we need a fundamental movement of people who are really understand that this is one of the critical objectives of our era, is to really create institutions which across the board upregulate wisdom and love in our culture, in our civilization, so that we can have any hope of managing the technologies that are already here and that are coming soon. Because if we don't, we're screwed. We're really screwed. Yeah. Anyway, I won't get into it, but you can read about how anybody with a desktop can create a bioweapon in 20 years and all this sort of thing. It's not a pretty picture.
Yes, I think that's right. And I also think we've been completely failing on the technology front of doing anything with that will actually make us more enlightened and more like increase the wisdom of love. And I don't see how using all techniques we can catch up, because technology is ramping up and we at some point are going to be left behind.
Totally.
And so I do believe in Masahiro Mori's thing, which is you have to try to figure out, he did say, I don't know how that's even going to work, but I don't see any other solution.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think this topic is really fascinating. I talked to Soryu Foral, the founder here. I did a podcast interview with him where we really dive deep into the topic of like contemplative technology. And I think it's an interest we both share from like Buddhist Geeks days. And I'm
for sure.
I feel both very cautious about it and very like compelled by it. Like I know from hearing from people like out in San Francisco who are in these scenes that they are getting to the point where they can bump people into essentially awakened consciousness using things like low frequency ultrasound and the right dose of different entheogens and the kind of psychotherapeutic technologies.
I knew there was some chemistry involved. There was definitely no just sounds, not.
Yeah. And somebody I trust, and he's like, I did like low frequency ultrasound, bumped me into like non-dual consciousness for a couple months. And I'm just like, whoa, that's really interesting. What he also said, which is extremely alarming, and this is consistent with what Soryu says, as well as the kind of position I would say of like conservative kind of monastic adepts, is that if you get awakening without ethical training, you can become
makes you a psychopath,
an enlightened psychopath. And it's even worse because you're not sensitive to the feedback loops, which would make you more ethical. You've escaped them. You've left them behind. And so it's tricky. If we released an enlightenment pill today and didn't also release an ethics pill, which I'm more skeptical we could create such a thing, then it might have the opposite of effect of what we wish it would have.
For sure it could. I actually, this is such a, maybe you have to schedule another call sometime, but I studied history. My undergrad degree is in history, and I was always fascinated with dictators and authoritarians, and in some of them, if you just read the stories of their lives, are clearly partially awakened. Like they clearly have escaped some of their limitations. Not all, and they definitely don't have any compassion or love or wisdom in a real sense. But I mean, if you just read about Mussolini and how he behaved in everyday life, nobody with a small ego could behave that way. He's partially free, but also at the same time couldn't give less of a damn about anybody. And that's what led to, I think, what we've seen in history.
Yeah. I mean, my friend says that he's already seeing this in California, like that he's seeing like tech executives who have access to capital and the networks where this stuff is being prototyped, who are able to reach persistent states of consciousness that are, these traditions have sought for a long time, but the experience, according to him, my friend, this is anecdotal, but that they basically are just assholes. Even more so than
not surprising.
It's not surprising.
There's a lot of assholes in spiritual tradition, in traditional traditions, and I guess it's just orthogonal, right? Like you could wake up from certain things without ever developing the ethics.
So when we talk about Maple and other instances of this kind of container, we talk about ecologies of practice, right? So meditation is just one practice in an ecology of other practices which are designed to compensate for some of the risks or downsides of the other practices. So one of the risks of meditation is this kind of over tendency towards nihilism or emptiness that can create a sort of debasement of ethics. And you can compensate for that with certain structures like community feedback systems. We do a kind of empathy dialoguing that we call circling, where you're really like being quite clear about the impact that you're having on other people and how you show up in relationship and what that does. Yeah, so there's like ways of designing systems that at least make it more likely that you, at the end of the kind of factory output, create somebody who's a little bit more trustworthy and ethical than otherwise. There's no such checks when you're just Wild West experimenting with neurohacking and technologies that might just bump you into an enlightened state, and then you're just like off to the races. You know?
I just recently learned that I know someone. I have an into Neuralink. Know someone whose girlfriend works there at a high scientific place. But yeah, I'm terrified and I'm hopeful at the same time. I know the gap between how good it could be and how bad it could be, depending on the decisions that we make along the way. And I have to keep reminding myself that half my life is already in the bank. Like they can't I've had 40 years. So every year I get extra is a bonus. And then I want to try to make things better for future generations. But there's people who are born now who maybe won't have the half a century almost that I've had, which was relatively good and stable.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I would know whatever we can do. And I think what you're doing is definitely an important component, and conversations like this are also an important component, at least I believe. And thank you so much, Daniel, for taking the time. And is there any place that people should go to find out more about you or to engage with you?
Well, I have a pretty diminished presence on the internet right now, but you can, if you like, you can listen to episodes of my podcast, probably anchor.fm/emerge, or if you just search for Emerge or Daniel Thorson, you'd find it. But I definitely would say if anything I said about the Monastic Academy resonates with you, do reach out, and I'd love to share more about what we're doing. This is an attempt to create a kind of cultural movement, and we'll see. It's a moonshot, and we do need support of all kinds. And so if you feel called or interested, love to share more with you or invite you to participate in a variety of ways.
Great. And I'll include all of these links and things in the show notes. So thank you, Daniel. Thanks so much.
This is a real pleasure. This is really fun. Thank you.
Great.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.